My name's Jason O'Hara. My film is State of Exception, and it's about community's resistance in Rio de Janeiro against forced eviction in advance of the 2014 World Cup and 2016 Olympics. There were about 75,000 residents in Rio who were being threatened with forced dislocation because of the events, and the film's about the grassroots resistance and community mobilizing that was taking place in the communities against that threat. So beginning in 2010, I went to Brazil to begin production, and I didn't have any contacts apart from a few activists who were working in the social movements. I'd lived in Brazil prior to this, but not in Rio, so I was really just going to begin pre-production research, yet just by circumstance was somewhat thrown into the midst of things on that first trip in 2010, where I witnessed one of the most brutal evictions I have witnessed to this day, which is the eviction you can see in the first few minutes of the film. And beginning on that first trip, I've always been interested in participatory media, an international movement that began with Challenge for Change here in Canada. And my previous experience in Brazil was doing participatory photography workshops with youth from living in the favelas across a number of metropolitan regions around the country. And being an outsider and knowing I wasn't going to be able to live in Brazil throughout production, I began engaging activists and residents to collaborate in the film through a participatory methodology, trying to, at least as a means to mitigate some of the problems inherent to a dynamic like this, with outsiders coming in and telling others' stories. And it's, not to say that my process was a resolution to those problems. I think, filmmaking and the ethics of filmmaking is inherently messy, and there's some strategies we can employ, which is what I was doing, that can mitigate some of those problems, and at least being conscious of them and working as engaging in a process that at least mitigates some of those problems. And so that's where we began in 2010, and I returned as often as I could. It usually was on average twice a year. I went for up to usually 3 to 4 weeks, but up to 6 weeks at a time. And every time I returned to Brazil, I was bringing back equipment and training people to use the equipment. And I should say, though, that the model of participation, that was never, when I first, in every situation in working with an activist or a community member, the first thing I'd say upon giving a camera within the first minute, as literally I'm handing over the equipment, would be to assure them that they don't owe me anything. They are not required to participate in the film. I obviously want their participation, but the participation should always be on their terms. So there's no contract, there's no agreement. It's whether they want to begin participating in 2-3 years down the road, revoke their participation, that's always within their right to do so. First and foremost, the equipment was for their own activism, because my film was always less important and secondary to the real organizing that was taking place by the people who are living this reality and working on the ground. So I really saw, I wanted to make an impactful, important film about this issue, but the issue was always more important than my little film, which was just a drop in the bucket in terms of the greater social movement that was beginning to mobilize around these issues. So I really saw this opportunity to engage with a broader social movement, and whatever happened with my film was always going to be secondary to that social movement. And it was, and now in hindsight, 7 years later, I feel it was a great privilege to participate in that movement more broadly. And a lot of that work was without a camera in hand. A lot of the mobilizing that takes place in my participation in that with those social movements wasn't with a camera in hand. But and not to undermine the importance or the value of documentary work. I think there is potential to make work like this and that can help foster social change. That was always my goal and great hope for the film, for it to have some social utility. You know, I came to filmmaking through activism. You know, the activism always came first. I like art and I'm interested in art and I like films, but I'm not really an artist, frankly. I chose this art form as for its power within an activist context. That's what drew me to filmmaking, and so yeah. Yeah, it's a great question. I think all of us filmmakers need to ask ourselves first, right at the outset when we're making any film, like, why am I the one to tell this story? And in this particular case, why on earth is yet a white man of all people, yet again, telling this, going to a foreign country and telling stories about the underprivileged, marginalized community, like yet again, the thing I personally despise. How is it that I find myself engaging in precisely the type of film I find so incredibly problematic? And really, the fact is, in 2010, when I was beginning the film, I was actually well placed. I was in a unique position to tell this story. Having spent 2 years living in Brazil, I had a grasp of the language. I could speak fluent Portuguese, and I do have a certain amount of privilege and access to equipment and so forth. Don't get me wrong, it's far better, and my great hope would be that other film work was done from the communities themselves. That would always be better, and I was certainly supportive and trying to support those other initiatives wherever they were happening. Yet, you know, I was willing and to commit to tell this story from my perspective and do a long-form documentary over the years. And yeah, I committed to doing that and followed through eventually. It took longer than I anticipated, but yeah. Well, I think the standard model of filmmaking could fall into this category, the extractive, like the status quo in doc filmmaking. Despite all our self-congratulation for our social justice filmmaking, the process is inherently extractive, and in that the goal is often the product of the film over the issues that the films are addressing. And you can see it, it's plain as day when you're in the field observing the way documentary crews conduct themselves. It's, you know, swoop in, it's all time is money, and it's all about getting the most story out of the minimum investment, and then, you know, doing the long form work and the long-term community engagement takes a lot of time. And when in a industry where time is money, it on average, people don't seem to have the time to commit to a longer process in which there's more engagement with the communities. And yeah, it's an unfortunate reality, but that seems to be the way things are these days. I think there's a lot of problems with the documentary industry. I mean, just that word, it's an industry that creates, you know, our films have become commodities in a system that's dominated by a broadcast funding model. And let's just be clear and frank about what the broadcast model is, what their business model is. Our films are merely an attractor for audience eyes for advertising. That is the entire business model in a commercial broadcast system. And that whole model is at total odds with a more radical political film that's going to challenge the status quo, or even better, challenge this systemic, the number of systemic problems that we're confronting as humanity. And those types of films are completely marginalized and alienated from this emerging broadcast system of producing films. So that's tremendously problematic. In terms of the standard practices in the industry, like I would have thought after Challenge for Change, despite it had its own problems, it wasn't perfect. Again, all of this ethics, ethics of filmmaking is messy, and it's always going to be messy. But Challenge for Change, at very least, was getting their hands dirty and being real and honest about the colonial dynamic of and the power dynamics and the privilege inequality of filmmaking. And they were at very least trying to address those problems. And what happened after Challenge for Change, we had the Filmmaker in Residence program and other little examples, but it hasn't become status quo as I would have thought. We haven't embraced those learnings and transformed the way we operate in the field. It's kind of this piece of history that, you know, hasn't really infiltrated our day-to-day practice. You know, for me, what Cinema Politica does in this country and internationally is absolutely essential, providing audiences for these radical films. Sometimes they say radical. I don't like that term because it puts us on the fringe. I don't think they're radical films. I think they're just good, honest political films. And they provide a platform for these films that just otherwise really struggle to find audiences. And I can speak personally as someone who makes a certain kind of film that we really struggle to find audiences. But more important than that is beyond just the screenings, you know, this whole model of just consuming films and then walking out the door and kind of patting ourselves on the back for having watched a film, and then you know, go home, maybe change our light bulbs, water our lawn less, but still feel okay about our you know, our own lifestyle and not really challenge ourselves. That's not the model of social change, filmmaking and film consumption. And Cinema Politica has always, you know, put equal, if not more focus on the mobilizing and community engagement that happens in conjunction with a film. So you ever attend a Cinema Politica event, be it here in Montreal or at any of the locals, they're always about much more than just the film. Because at the end of the day, films don't change the world. People change the world. And it's not, the film's not going to do a damn thing unless we're using the film as a platform for a broader discussion. No, not just a discussion, but a broader kind of engagement around these issues, and inviting the communities of focus to be part of that process, and providing them the platform, like through a film screening, to engage with the audiences. So when you leave Cinema Politica event, I hope more than just patting yourself on the back for changing light bulbs, you in some cases walk out of the theater maybe a little uncomfortable, and that's okay. You know, it's documentaries aren't just soft entertainment. They in many cases are about much more than that, and we need to make people feel uncomfortable. That's there's nothing wrong with that kind of film, and I think Cinema Politica has celebrated those kinds of films that are really challenging the status quo and addressing some of the most important issues of our time. So I just, I'm a great fan of this organization, what they do, and yeah, specifically the model that they've really developed themselves, because I'm not seeing that kind of community engagement happening around any other film screening series.